effect on impulse control, which impulsivity has a direct connection to quote-unquote criminality. Most all the crimes that Freddie Gray ever did were crimes of impulsiveness. It wasn't some sociopathic, criminogenic individual. And people said, well, why did he run from the police? Well, that's a pretty logical impulse when you're black in Baltimore, to be honest. And the fact that a lot of white folks can't understand that suggests that we think that police in the hood are there for the same reason that they're there in our neighborhood, to get the cat out of the tree, but that ain't why they came, right? So running from a police officer might not make sense in Auburn Hills, it might not make sense in Grosse Pointe. It makes plenty of sense given the history in a place like Baltimore, but even if it's not the best move, if you have had your blood poisoned by lead for years, your brain is not functioning the way that it should be because of a system of oppression that exposed you to those things, right? Now, it wasn't just Freddie Gray, and it wasn't just slumlords. Let's even get clear. It was the government. Here's how. In the 1990s, it was finally revealed that Johns Hopkins University, the Kennedy Krieger Institute in particular, right, had been engaged in a lead abatement study using federal dollars for the study, along with some private monies, but it was a federally funded effort, means taxpayer-funded effort. And what they were doing was they were recruiting poor, almost exclusively black families in Baltimore, and encouraging, one might say enticing, one might even say bribing them to go into various types of apartments that were available in the city, some of which had been pretty well abated of lead. Pretty much the lead had been cleared out. And then another set of the apartments where there was sort of a medium level of lead abatement. And then another level where there'd been virtually no lead abatement at all. And the purpose of enticing people to move into these was ostensibly to study the effect of lead on the brains of developing children. As if we don't already know the answer to the question, what does lead do to the brains of developing children? So in a sense, this is Tuskegee, you see, updated for modern times. We're going to experiment on people in the name of science. Objective science. And they justified this all kinds of ways, right? They said, well, a lot of these people were already exposed to lead, so at least the ones who go into the more abated facilities will probably see some improvement, you know. So they take these folks and they put them in 3 different levels of lead-abated housing. They bribe them to go in by giving them $50 gift certificates or t-shirts or a week's worth of groceries or whatever it was, right? So desperate people will do desperate things. They take their families into these places. What do you know? The kids that were in the heavily lead-abated areas did pretty well. Their blood levels of lead actually declined because they might have gone from a place that was worse to a place that was better. Fabulous, right? But the ones who went into the heavily lead-infested, non-abated places saw significant spikes in their lead levels in their blood, up to 3-4 times what is considered a safe average, right? And so their lives have been impaired, all for the sake of data gathering. Now, we already know, without having to do that study, what the effects of lead are. Obviously, the only humane solution would have been to knock down all the lead-infested housing, build non-lead-infested housing at whatever cost it took in order for people to be able to live lives that were not lead impaired. But you see, we couldn't do that. Why? Because it's too expensive. Where have you heard this before and recently? Right? That's just not, it's just not cost effective. We just can't give non-lead infested housing to people. We just can't do it. We can give huge incentives to sports teams to build stadiums, right? We can give huge incentives to corporations to move their plant to the community, even though when they promise all the jobs that they're going to create, they invariably never do, or they create them at a level that comes out to like $250,000 in expenses lost, in taxes lost, for every job you create that pays 60 or 70 at the best, right? So really you end up with a net outflow. Governments do that all the time. State governments do that, local governments do that. Incentives for corporations, for rich people, for millionaires. You got a team in St. Louis moving back to LA, right? The Rams are going back to LA. Why? Because St. Louis can't give them the kinds of incentives that they need to remain competitive, right? So they're going back to Los Angeles because Los Angeles will just throw money at them. So we throw money at the things that we care about. We throw money at the stuff that's important to us. We just don't throw money at the things that involve people of color. And Baltimore was a very good example of that, right? Nobody went to jail for that. You know, Johns Hopkins didn't lose any federal contracts for that. Nobody even, to my knowledge, lost their job over that. That was just the normal operating procedure for collecting scientific information. Now, think about New Orleans. What happened in New Orleans was often misunderstood, and I think 11 years later still is. a lot of people, even really well-intended, normally very insightful people, when it comes to issues of race, I think missed it. Right? You remember Spike Lee did a film right at the end of Katrina called When the Levees Broke, and it was a great film, really good movie, right? But one of the things he says, and I think he says it on camera in the film, but I know he said it during promotion for the film when he's being interviewed. One of the things he said was, what happened in Katrina was a system failure of monumental proportions. And I remember thinking, that is about as wrong as anything I've ever heard Spike Lee say. Now, why am I saying that that's wrong? The reason it's wrong ought to be rather obvious to you, right? It's only a system failure if you are surprised that it happened, and if you actually think that the system had been working every other day. Yeah. Right? If you think the system had been working for poor black folk in New Orleans prior to August 29th of 2005, I promise you've never been in New Orleans for more than like a minute, right? Because the system wasn't set up for those folks. That system had not been working for them forever. So think about it. What do we call it if there's a system that isn't set up for you and then it proceeds not to serve your interests? That's not system failure. That is system success. Yep. That is the system working exactly as it was intended to work. So there was nothing shocking. What had happened is very simple. The city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana collectively, mostly because of this group called the Levee Board, which oversees what money will and will not be spent and for what purposes, not only on levees, but also interstate overchanges, right, decided to divert money from levee construction. Right? The levees in New Orleans weren't even built strong enough for a Cat 3 storm. That category 2.5, maybe to category 3, but you get hurricanes that are bigger than that. And certainly Katrina was like a 3.5 to a 4. So it wasn't able to withstand. It withstood the storm. Remember, Katrina didn't do anything to New Orleans. The storm itself dumped a lot of water, but I lived in New Orleans for 10 years. We had bigger downpours of rain on a regular basis. There were at least 3 while I was living there that were worse in terms of just net rainfall. But the difference was that the wind created the overtopping of the levees afterward, pushing the water out of the lake into the city, and then it floods because those levees had not been constructed properly. And so what happens then, right, is that the levee board had diverted all that money. They took the money from levee construction. The Corps of Engineers, federal agency, Corps of Engineers, takes that money. They divert it to building off-ramps to get folks to the casinos that were out on the lake. Because again, our priorities, right? We got to build off-ramps to get folks to the gambling boats. This is before Harrah's had actually Harrah's already had their facility, but a lot of the gambling was bigger on the boats at that point. It's before Harrah's had gotten real big downtown. Right? And so that's where they put the money. So then at the end of the day, the levees are unprotected. And that was a decision made, I should point out, by Democrats and Republicans. It was a decision made by white and black lawmakers, right? It was a bipartisan crime. It was a multiracial crime. It was the result of elites, regardless of race and regardless of party, making decisions about working class and poor people's lives that suggested that certain people's lives don't matter, which, by the way, is why it is so important that we articulate openly and loudly that Black lives matter, because everything in this country's history and contemporary period tells us that the system doesn't believe that they do. That's why we have to articulate it. Not just because of police misconduct, but because these kinds of decisions are made cavalierly, specifically because of the bodies that are mostly affected. So when we say Black Lives Matter, it is a way of insisting that that which has been left out shall be articulated. We don't need to say all lives matter, as so many of my precious white brothers and sisters do, because we take for granted that all lives matter. But the problem is white people have a long history of saying all and not meaning it. Right? We said all men are created equal. We did not mean that. We said all men are created equal, right? They were guaranteed by their creator certain rights that were inalienable. We alienated those rights all the time, right? We didn't believe in that. We said all and didn't mean it. So we have to sort of understand when black and brown folks think maybe they have to be specific, right? Maybe they have to actually call some things out by name rather than just assume that they're part of the whole. Because for a lot of folks, they haven't been part of the whole. New Orleans proved that. Baltimore's proved that. And I think Flint is, as we speak, proving that, or at least the state of Michigan is vis-a-vis Flint. It's not y'all's fault. Right? So what's the other lesson, though, of that? Here's what's fascinating about the lesson of New Orleans and the lesson of Flint. That is, I think, also a very important thing for us to recognize right now in this election season. Because what's the other part of the history of America? when it comes to race and class, right? The history of America, race and class, are two things. One is that people of color are usually the canary in the coal mine, as Lonnie Guinier says, right? Yeah. They're the first ones injured, but they ain't the only ones injured, right? And in fact, precisely because they're the first ones injured, sometimes we act like it isn't any big deal, right? Oh, well, it's just them. You know, they're the ones who are having subprime loans thrown at them in the early 90s, but it's only their neighborhood, so we're not gonna step in and do anything. And then by the early 2000s, those same banks and predatory lenders that have been ripping off black and brown folks for years decide, well, what the heck, man, if we can do that there, we can go into the rural communities and the small towns and the suburbs, right? And we can start getting, you know, we can rip those people off too. And that's what happened. That's how millions of white families ended up getting upside down in their mortgages during the recession, right? Because we didn't put an end to predatory lending when it was only hurting black and brown folks, because it's only hurting them, right? And that's how it often works, right? That the first one injured is, and then you just think it's not on you, but then think about New Orleans, right? So I'm sure there were some white folks who really didn't care about the lower Ninth Ward, virtually all black, 94% African American community. I should also point out, contrary to the media stereotype, the lower Ninth Ward was the wealthiest in terms of home ownership black community in the United States, highest rate of home ownership percentage-wise of any black community in America. But all they could talk about on the news was, oh, the Ninth Ward filled with projects. Actually, there are no public housing projects in the lower Ninth Ward. They're in the upper Ninth Ward. So once again, don't speak about a community that you don't know anything about. But that's what folks did, and they rendered that community a tangle of pathology. Now, I'm sure that's how a lot of white folks in New Orleans and the New Orleans area saw it. I know that's the case, having lived there for 10 years. What was ironic, there's a community right across the street from the Ninth Ward, right? Right across the street, it's in St. Bernard Parish. It's called Chalmette, right? That's the dividing line of the parish, is right there between the Ninth Ward and Chalmette, St. Bernard Parish. St. Bernard Parish is as white as the Ninth Ward is black, about 95%. It's also a working class space, though. Not a wealthy community, working class white folks.